Okay, good morning everybody. How are you doing? Okay, now we come to another presentation, this time entitled Human Learning, and it will be presented by Zakaria Jumati and Abdelaziz Eftal and me, Muhammad Madani Yusuf. And we are based on the book Principles of Language Learning and Teaching by Douglas Brown. And we are going to follow this outline. First of all, we will tackle learning and training. Then we will move to Pavlov's classical behaviorism. Then Skinner's operant conditioning. And then to Ausubel's subsumption theory with two subpoints, root versus meaningful learning and systematic forgetting. And we'll move to see with Zakaria Rogers' humanistic psychology and types of learning in second language acquisition, transfer, interference, and/or overgeneralization, and he will end up with inductive and deductive reasoning. And then we will see with Sheikh Aziz language aptitude, intelligence and language learning, and then learning theories in action, two language teaching methods in contrast, especially the audiolingual method and community language learning. Before we start, we'd like to ask certain questions. The first question is that how do human beings learn? And then the second one is that are there certain basic principles of learning that apply to all learning acts? The third question is that is one theory of learning better than another? These three questions and other questions are going to be answered in the coming slides. First of all, before we start teaching or training any organism or any subject or any person, we'd like to have certain knowledge about 5 or 4 points. The first point is that the entry behavior of a person means that we should know the abilities of this person, his needs, his desires, what he can do and what he cannot do. And also we should know the prior knowledge of this person. And then we will move to set the objectives, what we want to teach this person, or what we want this person to reach or to achieve. For example, we may have long-term objectives, short-term objectives, and then based on these objectives and the entry behavior, we are going to divide or to derive certain possible methods. Where to begin, for example, and we have to set certain alternative methods if we fail, for example, to achieve what we want to achieve with the first method. We may, for example, put a plan B. And then the last point is evaluation and procedure. That's what we are going to do to determine whether this person achieves these objectives or not. And before we're tackling the theories, we'd like to give a definition of learning. The first definition is that acquiring or getting knowledge of the subject or a skill by study, experience, or instruction. The second definition is a relatively permanent change in behavioral tendency, the result of reinforced practice. Means that we have here two definitions and we have other definitions. This means that one may look at learning in different points of view, in different ways. That is to say that this is why we have different theories, since we look at learning in different angles, for example. The first theory is that of Pavlov's classical behaviorism. And the most known person or the most known founder is Russian psychologist Ivan Pavlov. And for him, learning process consisted of the formation of associations between stimuli and reflexive responses. It means that learning, according to Pavlov, means that we should make an association between a stimuli and response. It means that we should train the person or the organism to give directly a certain response to a certain stimuli. And here is his most known experiment, in which he trained the dog to salivate to the natural stimulus by peering the bed with the food. And by repeated occurrence, the dog is trained to salivate to the bed, to the sound of the bed, even it is neutral stimulus, but by peering it with the meaningful stimulus becomes, or it gained the power to salivate to the neutral stimulus. Drawing on Pavlov's findings, John B. Watson in 1913 coined the term behaviorism. In the empirical tradition of John Locke, Watson contended that human behavior should be studied objectively. It means that we should be concerned with the observable behaviors. We are not going to concern ourselves with the notions of innateness, instincts, or what happen, or the mental processes, what happens inside in the brain. We are concerned with what we observe. Language teaching practices, likewise, for many years, were influenced by behavioristic tradition. Means many methods and many language teaching approaches were influenced by this theory, especially if you still remember the audiolingual method. Now we move to Skinner's operant conditioning. For Skinner, the classical conditioning of Pavlov was a highly specialized form of learning utilized mainly by animals and playing little part in human conditioning. Skinner comes to see that this, or Pavlov's classical conditioning, works more on animals more than humans. That's why he comes to add certain things to behaviorism, and he is called new behaviorists by certain psychologists like Anderson, for example, and AUSUBEL. Skinner called Pavlov the conditioning respondent conditioning. Why? Because it is concerned with respondent behavior. It is concerned with the preceding stimulus that elicit the response. But unlike in Skinner's theory, operant behavior is a behavior in which one operates on the environment. Here we are no longer concerned with the preceding stimulus, but we are concerned with the outcomes, the consequences, what comes after the behavior. Response should be reinforced until finally a particular concept or behavior was learned, not by peering, for example, the stimulus, but we should reinforce the response so as to give it the likelihood to reoccur again. We are governed by the consequences of our behavior, and according to Skinner, we should study the effect of these consequences on our responses, so as to know which consequence that we are going to do, or to give this response so as to reoccur again, or maybe to lead it to extinction. Because a reinforcer that may work best with X learner may not work best with Y learner.
Based on the principle of stimulus response.
Yes.
Okay, so whenever you have some kind of response. So if the response is positive, so the stimulus
will reoccur again.
And also the reinforcement, it also explains this, the consequences governed by our behavior. So when we have something positive, we will reinforce, so we continue doing it.
Yes, we can.
But when we are not reinforced, we will let it.
Until it becomes a habit, yes.
Governed by the consequences of our behavior.
And there is a definition of operants are sets of responses that are emitted and governed by the consequences they produce. In contrast, we find that respondents are sets of responses that are elicited by identifiable stimuli. And here is an example. Crying, for example, may be both, either a respondent or an operant. It is a respondent, for example, if it is elicited by the preceding stimulus. It comes, for example, as a reaction of receiving hurt. If the child is hurt, he's going to cry, for example. But in case the child cries, for example, so as to achieve certain consequence, maybe to be played with, to be fed, here in this case it is an operant. It's not a respondent. Because the consequence that influences this behavior, it's not the preceding stimuli. In addition to reinforcement, we have punishment as another consequence. It means that consequence is not only reinforcement, but also punishment. But we should not think of punishment as only presenting an aversive stimuli, but it is also a removal of positive reinforcer, for example. Let's say that if a student misbehaves in the classroom, and if you give other students a break, for example, or time to play a game, for example, you may deprive that person from taking the break as a removal of positive reinforcer. And according to Skinner, no punishment should be meted out without positively reinforcing alternate responses. Means that if we punish a certain misbehavior, we should reinforce the alternative response so as to hasten the possibility that the first misbehavior will be extinguished. For example, if students or if children play football in the living room, instead of punishing them, for example, in doing so, we may reinforce them if they play football outside of the house, for example. Skinner's theories had an impact on our understanding of human learning and on education. In classrooms nowadays, we find that there is reinforcement, there is eye contact, there is frown, there is praise. It is influenced by the theory of Skinner. And his book, The Technology of Teaching, 1968, was a classic in the field of programmed instruction. Means that according to him, we may teach certain subject matters via or virtually, and we can do that successfully and efficiently if we have a designed program by step-by-step reinforcement. And if you remember, for example, with the software of hot potato, for example, if you get the correct answer, you receive reinforcement very well, or well done, for example, very good, and so on and so on. And in certain other softwares, you may find that when you get the correct answer, you hear applause, for example. And that's a reinforcement. Skinnerian view of both language and language learning dominated foreign language teaching methodology for several decades. It's just as a conclusion. Now we move to another theory with Ausubel that is called AUSUBELSUBSUMPTION theory. And according to David Ausubel, he contended that learning takes place in the human organism through a meaningful process of relating new events or items to already existing cognitive concepts or propositions. Means that according to him, learning takes place when we incorporate new items to our memory, but in relation to what exists there, the existing cognitive structure. Not in random, not in an arbitrary way, but we make an association between the two. Maybe we compare it with it, or we contrast it with what already know. And his theory is known or is best understood if we contrast rote learning with meaningful learning. And according to him, the rote learning is the process of acquiring material as discrete and relatively isolated entities that are relatable to cognitive structure only in an arbitrary and verbatim fashion. Means that we store the new material, the new information in our brain, but without or with little association with what exists there, for example, the already existing schema, for example. And by the way, he's influenced by the cognitive psychologist Piaget. Meaningful learning, subsumption is called also subsumption, the process of relating and anchoring new material to relevant established entities in cognitive structure. In meaningful learning, we incorporate, we store the new material, but we make a relationship between what we have just learned with what already exists in the cognitive structure. And here accounts for its meaningfulness. When we want to retrieve, when it comes to retention, we can retain it, or the retention becomes efficient. Why? Because there is a relationship between what already exists there, the stable elements in our head, and then what we have just learned. And for him, for a learning situation to be meaningful, there should be two conditions. The first one is that learners should have a meaningful learning set. Means that disposition to relate the new material to the existing material. Means that they should be in the usual mode, in the usual temperament. And here we can remember, for example, the idea of crushing. Means to create a friendly atmosphere for this person to find it easy to relate the new material with the existing knowledge or material. The learning task itself should be potentially meaningful to the learners. Means that this new material should be capable of being related to the existing cognitive structure. That's why we should take into account the prior knowledge of the students before teaching them. That's why we say, as the first point in the first slide, the entry behavior of the person. We should know the entry behavior of the person, and among these things is that the prior knowledge of this person. Another method of establishing meaningfulness is what Frank Smith called manufacturing meaningfulness. Means that we can make things meaningful if it is necessary, and if we have a highly motivation to do so. For example, students cramming for an exam, they can make things meaningful. They create mnemonic devices so as to remember things. And because they know that by the retention of these mnemonic device will lead to the retention of the whole list of items. For example, so as to know or to remember the Great Lakes in America, you may just put them in a sentence. Superman helps everyone. Here, super here as an S stands for superior. Man stands for Michigan. M stands for Michigan. Helps here we have H, may stand for Huron. And every, we have E here stands for area. And we have one, it's everyone, it stands for Ontario. If you remember this sentence, you are going to remember the five names. The distinction between rote and meaningful learning may not at first appear to be important, since in either case material can be learned. We may say that what's the difference then, if in both cases we can learn? But yes, when it comes to retention, when it comes to long-term memory, there is a difference. Because in the material that is rotely learned, it is easy, yes. Yes, it is easily to be retained. Yes. And here comes the systematic forgetting to explain the difference between the two. The retention of rotely learned material is influenced primarily by the interfering effects of similar root materials. Means that those rotely learned materials will not be retained because they are going to be there is going to be an interference between the previously known information and maybe the information that we have learned in the future. In proactive, for example, inhibition, this new material that we have just learned may interfere with the existing information that is similar to this, to this material, for example. But in retroactive inhibition, it will be influenced negatively by what we will learn in the future, for example. If it is similar to what we have just learned, there will be a certain interference, and it becomes difficult to retain the information. But unlike in meaningful learning, or concurrent interfering effects have relatively little influence on meaningful learning, and the retention is highly efficient. Means those materials that are learned via meaningful learning, they become easy to be retained, not as in rote learning. The importance of a specific item tends to be incorporated into the generalized meaning of the larger item, because it is easy to remember a larger item than to remember the specific items. That's why we incorporate these specific items into a larger item. For example, those Greek names, we incorporate them in one sentence. The specific items become progressively less identifiable as entities in their own right, until they are finally no longer available and are said to be forgotten. For example, the child, before he constructs the concept of hotness, he will through certain experiences. Maybe he is exposed to a hot kettle, to a hot cafe, to a hot iron. These experiences combined together to give us the term hotness. The term hotness. Hot. And the child will no longer remember those experiences. because the concept is there. And this is what we call the cognitive substantive stage. Is called, for example, the cognitive pruning. And here is a definition of pruning. Pruning is the elimination of unnecessary clutter and clearing of the way for more material to enter the cognitive field. It resembles here the way, for example, when we clutter a tree, so as to give it a chance for greater growth, for example, and for fuller growth. It's the same thing that happens in the brain, for example. We may pave the way for other materials to enter our head. An important aspect of the pruning stage of learning is that substantive forgetting or pruning is not haphazard or once. It is systematic. Means that we don't forget at once, or means that there is the forgetting happens regularly. We may just forget the specific details about a certain thing, then part of the whole idea, for example, then another part until we forget the whole idea. And there are certain implications of Ausubel's theory in learning a second language. The first one is that the importance of meaning in language and of meaningful context for linguistic communication means that the context is important. We should create a context not of rote learning, but a context of real communication. The rejection of conditioning models of practice and repetition in language teaching means that we reject certain ideas, for example, that of repetition, that of imitation, since it will not lead to retention of the information. In early stages of language learning, certain devices, definitions, paradigms, illustrations, or rules are often used to facilitate subsumption in the early stage of learning. For example, before we start, students learn certain definitions, they learn certain rules, but when they find it easily to converse, to communicate, these definitions are said to be pruned out. Because the goal there is not to communicate. We forgot about those definitions and those rules. We use them easily, and we are aware of these definitions and rules. Okay, and I leave the floor for Zakaria to finish the presentation.